I actually used to watch a lot of Chris Stuckman's videos back in the day. I think he made fun reviews, fun little like top tens, and some cool breakdowns of, where he goes a little bit more in depth into some movies. And from that perspective, I was really glad for him to see that he was finally able to make his first feature film.
Welcome back to the paranormal shit.
And in general, I think it's a good thing that we're seeing more movement between like the YouTube space and the sort of traditional world of filmmaking. I think that's just a bridge that, when it's more established, will benefit anyone going back and forth. So yeah, I've been keeping my eye on this film for quite a while, and I was finally able to see it. And I think it's a somewhat conflicted one.
Wait. It's fine.
There was a review somewhere that I can't seem to find anymore, but it basically said that, it's not so much about YouTubers becoming filmmakers, but, the interesting thing is that it's a movie critic who's now becoming a filmmaker, and that's something that has a bit more of a historical precedent than YouTubers becoming filmmakers, even though there are also already YouTubers who have done so. But anyways, film history has been filled with movie critics who at some point became filmmakers themselves. And what this reviewer pointed out is that this is usually because the critic, after sort of mastering the craft from the sidelines, or, getting a sense of the industry or the kind of body of work of cinema that already exists, at some point comes to like perceive a gap or something that they themselves feel like hasn't been articulated yet, and that they feel like they could contribute by becoming more of an artist themselves. So in short, they're driven by a kind of need to contribute something, not just to the world of movies, not just to add like their movie to the established body of work, but also to contribute something to the film form, to add their own voice to it, to do something different, or to do something that hasn't been done before. And this, of course, stands in contrast with convention, with the things that have already been done, or the studios that keep making the same things over and over again. And in this sense, I think Shelby Oaks was interesting because it kind of goes right through the middle. There's a part of it that I think is a genuine reflection, or that feels like a genuine reflection of who Chris Stuckman is as a person and as an artist. It feels like there's something genuine of himself behind that part of the movie.
This is Riley as I know her. My little sister.
But on the other side, there's also this other part that feels like it's just generic, almost AI-generated rehashing of already established tropes and cliches from the horror genre. And to me, that just feels like a shame because, even Chris Stuckman himself has talked about at some point only wanting to do positive reviews because he's come to appreciate the art of filmmaking from the point of view where he sees every movie as basically a miracle, and he just really appreciates the craft that goes behind creating such a miracle. And to some extent, I agree, but for me, it's also because it's so miraculous for a movie to get made, or, more specifically for a movie that is also a genuine expression of something or someone, a genuine artistic expression, that I think it's all the more important not to waste that opportunity and to really take a swing for it when you have that one shot to do so. And in that sense, Shelby Oaks disappointed me because I feel like it took a swing and then sort of pulled back halfway through. It feels like he was holding back, and that's not necessarily to say that he had to make some kind of big swing artistically or that he had to make some grand elevated horror piece. Even a B horror movie, which this basically is, can still be innovative and inventive and creative. And I feel like I got only halfway there. So let's just get into the specifics of it a little bit more, because I think that will clarify what I'm talking about here.
YouTube was brand new. Nobody knew what it could be or who might be watching.
So to start with the positives, I think there's basically two elements here that I think were genuinely great and genuinely interesting, and that felt like a true reflection of Chris Stuckman as a person, or at least insofar as I got to know him through what he talked about in his videos. And the first one has to do with the formatting, which we mostly see in the first half hour or so. and the second one with some later stuff that develops with the kind of cultish elements. But first, let's talk about that first act, in which we basically have this found footage, mixed format compilation of the what were they called? The paranormal paranoids, which was this YouTube channel of a couple of friends who investigated paranormal activities and then made YouTube videos about it, basically.
Nearly every time they filmed, they captured something most paranormal researchers spend their entire lives looking for.
I've actually always enjoyed this formatting very much, that kind of mixed formatting between self-made footage from the YouTubers, newsreels, there's documentary interviews, there's a whole collection here that kind of forms this mosaic of not just the main character or one of the main characters, that the sister who ends up disappearing, but also of a kind of era in time, there's a moment in time, which feels like it very much reflects Chris Stuckman's his own nostalgia or his own history as a YouTuber in the early days of YouTube. And again, I think this was a genuinely fun bit. It had me invested. I wanted to learn more about these characters. I wanted to learn more about the mystery, and I got that to some extent, and I even liked the sort of transition into the more traditional format that we then have for the rest of the movie. So far I was on board with everything, and from here on I'm gonna get into some spoilers, so do a little spoiler marker here. After this, the movie transforms into a much more conventional horror movie where Mia then goes looking for her sister in the present day based on some clues and some old tapes that she found. And at this point, you kind of start to feel the low budget aspect of this movie. It was shot for very little money, but I think in the first 20-30 minutes or so, you don't really notice it because, the format that they're using, shooting with all these old YouTube cameras, or YouTube cameras, just old cameras that a lot of YouTubers used back in the day. You don't notice because it feels true to the time, but when it then cuts to something more conventional to this era, and you see a lot of movie scenes that are reminiscent of others, which were made with much higher budgets, then in comparison, the low budget of Shelby Oaks really starts to stand out. And this is not necessarily a problem, but it does become a bit of a problem when it feels like the script itself also feels a bit impoverished compared to some bigger, better movies that clearly inspired this one. There's a scene where Mia goes to a prison and it's just kind of her lurking around in the dark with some jump scares, and at this point I was kind of losing interest a little bit. It was a fine sequence, but not a particularly interesting one on a deeper sort of narrative level. But where the movie did take an interesting turn and where it almost kind of had me back on board, so to say, is where it was revealed that Riley, the missing sister, had actually been held in captivity by this weird guy and his mother, I think it was, and who had been repeatedly abusing her and getting her pregnant and then having miscarriages and having, there's a lot of photos where she buries one baby after another and becoming like increasingly disheveled and just traumatized. And that revelation to me was really effective. That really captured some real horror behind, the more innocent sort of ghost chasing that we saw mostly in the first 20-30 minutes or so. And it's something that feels like it is inspired by Chris, his own experiences that he talked about growing up in this very strict and rigid religious community. I forget what it was. I think maybe the Jehovah's Witnesses, which is obviously not to say that this literally happened to him, but it does feel like there's a kind of symbolic connection there where he draws inspiration from the sort of feeling of being trapped in a space that feels abusive and that kind of cuts you off from other family members and the outside world in general. And again, I think this was really well done, and together with the early YouTube stuff really captured something of Chris himself. It feels like there's some, like a genuine artistic voice that kind of shines through in these moments, both a positive and a negative one. There's the joy of discovery and chasing mysteries in that first half, and then a deeper revelation of horror and tragedy in that second layer that is revealed in the second half of the movie. But where I think this movie truly goes off the rails is with the sort of demonic entity itself. At some point it is revealed that there's a demonic presence that has been haunting these sisters in their youth, and that has also been controlling the town of Shelby Oaks and the bad guy who did or who captured Riley, the missing sister. And this demonic entity is revealed to be Incubus, which is an actually existing demon, or it's a real demon in the sense that it already existed in pre-existing mythologies and religious stories and so on. And the movie does this silly thing where the character then opens a book to study the demonic presence, and the one that they find is the exact one that happens to be haunting them. And to me, it just felt like a complete mismatch with the rest of the story, because when you invoke a demon that has such a big, like, pre-existing weight to it, and in a particular sort of religious, a lot of religious connotations and that sort of stuff, it just felt like it immediately caused friction with everything that came before, where you have these first 20 minutes where these YouTubers are just investigating local legends and chasing little ghosts, and then suddenly it is revealed, the big bad guy is this iconic demon that's been haunting humanity throughout history and has now chosen to zero in on these two girls in this really small town that no one's even heard of. It just feels too big for the scope of this story. I think it would have been so much better even if the bad entity had been revealed to just been some kind of local thing. You can just make up a ghost or a demon. It doesn't have to be one that's mentioned in biblical texts or wherever Incubus originally came from. I'm not even sure. For me, it just kind of undermined the sort of real horror that the movie captured just, minutes earlier when we got that reveal of Riley being captured and tormented over all these years. I feel like there's a very real horror then, and I think if you look at movies like Lake Mungo, for example, which is an obvious inspiration to this one, that movie also had supernatural elements, but those were much more like toned down in order to draw attention to the actual horror, which was also more of a human tragedy that took place in that story. And I think in Shelby Oaks, what we have is that we kind of see it's the other way around, where you have this very real human horror unfolding, this truly terrible tragedy that befell this one person, but it just becomes overshadowed by this greater, bigger entity that just kind of washes it out. And I think the movie would have just been much better if it toned down that demonic presence with all the hellhounds and the lore, and just have it be some kind of local legend that's also maybe more tied in with the original investigation that we saw through the found footage, the paranormal paranoids, what they were doing, and then have the real focus of the horror be the very real human evil instead of the fake spiritual one. It also doesn't help that towards the end the movie just becomes like this grab bag of influences from other movies. Hereditary is a clear one. The Exorcist, even Rosemary's Baby, it becomes more like a bird's flight through previous horror cliches rather than a conclusion to its own story. And to me, it really got to the point where it felt like the movie just lost its own identity completely in favor of like hinting towards other movies or paying homages to other movies and what they've already done. And again, as I also mentioned earlier, because it's so low budget, it also becomes like a kind of cheap knockoff of all those other better movies. And it's a shame, because I do think even in that conclusion, there was a lot of good stuff here. I think after the moment where Riley is rescued, I thought that opened up a really interesting final story arc, or a third act, where she then has to cope with the trauma and cope with her relationship to her own baby, which was created out of evil, and which then causes friction with Mia, her sister, who herself wasn't able to have a baby for some reason, which is weirdly brought up earlier in the movie, but it is relevant to the end, so I guess he had to kind of establish those seeds. But the point is, there were a lot of ingredients here to have like a satisfying finale. And to some extent, the right story is there, I think, where you have this conflict that erupts where Riley wants to kill the baby, Mia wants to protect it, and in that struggle she kind of ends up losing her sister anyways. But again, I just don't think the movie did the right amount of character work to really pull that off. Instead it focused more on kind of the shape of a horror movie instead of the actual content of it. Towards the end there's a lot of scenes that remind you of other scenes, and those give you the impression that you kind of know what the movie is doing already. That's what I mean when I say the movie has the sort of shape of a horror movie or a good horror movie. Most obvious example here is the actual ending where Riley has died and Mia kind of stands watching in horror as the demonic presence or incubus puts his hand on her shoulder, and then her eyes turn yellowish and she kind of screams out in horror, and that's the end, cut to black. And that's a very common visual. I think Mike Flanagan, for example, who also produced this movie, did this very well in House on Haunted Hill, I think it was. Haunting of Hill House. There was an episode there that also ended with this woman kind of screaming out in horror, and it was one of the best moments I've ever seen in a horror story. But in that story, it actually built that character arc, and it actually led to this big tragic revelation. And then when she then screams out, you really feel her pain and her horror, and that's what makes that kind of shot so effective. It really brings you along to the high note and then cuts there. And I feel like Shelby Oaks wanted to do something similar, and clearly, it had the right shape, it was doing the thing literally, but it just didn't feel like it had the content to actually give it weight. There's kind of a twist where it's suggested that the demon was after Mia all along and not Riley, who was captured, but it just doesn't feel like this makes any sense. It's just a twist for the sake of a twist. It didn't feel like the demon was actually doing anything throughout this movie, except maybe trying to make a baby with this one sister who couldn't have one for some reason, and then wanted to possess the other one. I'm not even sure. I think even when the audience understands that the demon is bad and that obviously a demon baby would be bad, I do think you still need to build an argument within the sort of context of your own narrative for why this is bad and what's going to happen, because the movie doesn't really touch on the consequences of this demon as far as I can remember, except for that it's just a bad demonic presence that kills people and wants to make a baby for some reason. But again, there just wasn't enough content here to really give that demon enough presence or weight. And by extension, why then the twist kind of feels like a hollow imitation of similar ones that we've gotten before or that we've seen before. And so those to me are the kind of two sides of Shelby Oaks. On the one hand, we have a genuinely refreshing found footage movie and partially a regular footage movie about the YouTube age and about the joy of chasing mysteries and about the actual real human horror that might be lurking beneath them, and which is also the part that feels personal, that feels like it offers a perspective that we couldn't get anywhere else. It feels like no one but Chris Stockman could have made exactly like this because it uses so much of his own experiences and perspectives and beliefs and so on. And on the other hand, we have what feels more like a randomly generated horror movie pastiche, just a tribute to some other movies with a lesser budget and with lesser content to it. And again, to me, that just felt like a bit of a shame because it clearly had some potential. Chris Stockman clearly has something to say. And I liked the way he went about saying those things. I'm not arguing that he should have made a more elevated horror movie. In fact, I think that first half of his, the kind of more whimsical, whimsy maybe not the right word, but kind of more playful approach to horror with the found footage and the YouTube context, I thought that was a lot of fun, and that was actually what I found most refreshing about this movie. And I don't think it should have committed all the way to that format, but I would be curious to see a version of this that did, and that just took it all the way to see what was on the other side instead of kind of pivoting to these more conventional horror movie tropes. But I don't know, maybe he is still trying to find his voice, maybe he will have a more interesting perspective in his next movie. I'd be curious to see that if it ever comes about, but maybe not. He does seem like someone who's more of a film fan than a true sort of artist. But again, I don't know, I've never met Chris, I don't know him personally, so I guess time will tell.